I'm recording this because I keep waking up to the sound of water moving the wrong way. Not rushing downhill, not spilling, but pulling. I used to sleep through anything. Sirens, helicopters, the neighbor's TV bleeding through the wall at 3 in the morning. 11 years on night shift will do that to you. You learn how to shut parts of yourself down. You learn how to rest with one eye open. You learn that most noises have explanations if you don't stare at them too long. This one doesn't. It starts low, almost polite. A pressure in the walls, a faint vibration in the pipes. Then it sharpens, just enough to wake me. The sound of something inhaling slowly, patiently, like it knows I'll listen eventually. I've tried pretending it's normal. Old plumbing. City infrastructure older than the people who walk on it. That's what I tell myself when I sit up in bed, heart already beating too fast, sweat cold on my neck. Not real. Real. Not real. That's the phrase I use when things start slipping. I picked it up somewhere along the way, training, maybe, or therapy after my second shooting. You say it until the edges stop blurring. You say it until the room feels solid again. It doesn't work anymore. This tape isn't a police report. I stopped filing those a long time ago. This is just a record. A confession, maybe. Something I need to get out of my head before it finishes settling in. Because once you see something crawl out of a storm drain, you don't really stop seeing it. You just learn how to look past it during the day. My name doesn't matter. The badge doesn't matter. What matters is that I was there, and I didn't look away when I should have. I noticed something that had been doing just fine without being noticed. That's how these things start. Boyle Heights, night shift. The kind of neighborhood that hums even when the streets are empty. Old houses, older sidewalks, murals fading into brick. People say the city sleeps, but that part of Los Angeles never really does. It just lowers its voice. The rain had started late that night. Not a storm, just enough to slick the streets and stretch the reflections. Streetlights turning puddles into broken mirrors, the air heavy with wet concrete and something sour underneath, like rust that's been breathing. Dispatch called it in as a noise complaint, possible transient activity near an alley off Whittier. Scraping sounds. Movement. Nothing urgent. Nothing that needed backup. I remember laughing when they said it. A quick, automatic sound. The kind you make when you want to keep things normal. I parked my cruiser at the mouth of the alley and sat there for a moment longer than I should have. Engine idling. Wipers ticking back and forth. The radio murmuring to itself. That was the first warning sign. The hesitation. The alley was narrow, boxed in by chain-link fences and the backs of buildings that had long ago given up on looking friendly. The ground sloped slightly downward toward the storm drain at the far end. Water traced thin lines along the cracks, all of it drifting toward that dark rectangle in the pavement. I stepped out of the car and immediately felt like I was interrupting something. It wasn't quiet. Not exactly. There were distant cars, a dog barking somewhere far off, the soft hiss of rain. But underneath it all was a sense of waiting, like the alley was holding its breath. I told myself that was nonsense. You spend enough nights alone, your brain starts inventing moods for places. That's not fear. That's fatigue. Still, my hand didn't leave my flashlight. The storm drain was old, cast iron bars thick enough to stop a tire, edges worn smooth by decades of water and trash and time. Leaves clung to it like they didn't want to go any closer. The water pooled just before the grate, swirling lazily instead of disappearing like it should have. I remember thinking that was strange. Not frightening, just wrong in a small, technical way. Like a sentence with one word out of place. I leaned forward and shined my light down through the bars. At first, there was nothing, just darkness layered on darkness. The beam caught on damp concrete a few feet down, on debris lodged against the sides. A bottle cap, a strip of plastic, ordinary things. Then I heard it. A sound so soft I almost missed it. A long, steady intake of air. It didn't echo like the alley sounds. It didn't bounce or fade. It felt close, intimate, like someone standing just out of sight, breathing through their mouth. I froze. Every explanation lined up in my head at once. Air displacement, pressure change, the rain, old pipes, rats, anything but what my body was already deciding. The sound stopped. Silence slammed down hard enough to make my ears ring. That was the moment I should have stepped back, called it in, walked away. That was the moment before the story really started. Instead, I leaned closer. And somewhere beneath the street, something shifted, like it had been waiting for me to do exactly that. Not real. Real. Not real. I told myself it was just a storm drain. That's the thing about places like Boyle Heights at night. You start cataloging everything. Shadows. Corners. Sounds. You reduce them to lists so they don't turn into questions. Questions are dangerous. Questions invite answers. I straightened up and stepped back from the grate, feeling foolish for how tight my chest had gotten. The alley looked the same as it had when I arrived. Same slick pavement. Same sagging fence. Same graffiti peeling off brick like old skin. Nothing had changed. Except me. I keyed my radio and gave dispatch a quick update. Cleared the call. No sign of anyone. Probably animals. My voice sounded steady enough that I almost believed it. The radio crackled back with acknowledgement, already moving on to the next problem somewhere else in the city. That should have been the end of it. But as I turned to walk back toward the cruiser, I felt it again. That sense of pressure. Like standing too close to someone in an elevator. The awareness of presence without proof. I stopped. The rain had picked up slightly, beads running down the alley walls, tapping softly against metal and concrete. Water flowed toward the drain, but now I noticed something I hadn't before. The movement wasn't smooth. It hesitated, pulsed. As if the drain were swallowing in slow, deliberate gulps, I shook my head and forced myself forward. Fatigue. That was all. I'd worked 6 nights straight. Anyone would start seeing patterns that weren't there. Still, my pace slowed as I passed the drain again, my eyes flicking down despite my best effort not to. The darkness beneath the bars seemed thicker now. Deeper, like the light didn't want to stay there. That's when I heard movement. Not scurrying, not scratching. It was a dragging sound, wet and deliberate. Like something pulling itself forward across a rough surface. It came from below the street, from a place that should have been nothing but runoff and shadow. My hand went to my weapon without conscious thought. Training takes over before fear has time to speak. I planted my feet and angled the flashlight down again, telling myself that whatever I saw, I could handle it. Rats can be big. People hide in places they shouldn't. There's always an explanation. The beam cut through the dark and caught on something pale. At first I thought it was trash. A plastic bag, maybe, snagged and fluttering. But it didn't move like trash. It moved with intention. Slow. Careful. As if it were testing the space. It slid closer to the bars, and I saw that it wasn't flat. It had depth, curves, edges that bent at wrong angles. A hand. That was the word my mind supplied, even as it rejected it. Too long. Too thin. The fingers, or what looked like fingers, were jointed strangely, bending more times than they should have. They pressed against the underside of the grate, pale against black iron, leaving faint smears that vanished almost immediately. I couldn't move. The dragging sound grew louder, closer, accompanied by that same breathing noise I'd heard before. Slow, controlled, curious. I told myself to shout, to demand identification, to do anything that might break the moment. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. The thing beneath the drain shifted again, and for a fraction of a second, the light caught something else. A suggestion of a shape behind the hand, a curve that might have been a shoulder or a head. Then it reacted. The flashlight beam trembled as my grip tightened, and the thing recoiled as if burned. The hand snapped back into the darkness with startling speed, joints folding in on themselves. The breathing cut off mid-inhale. Silence flooded the alley. I stood there for a long time after that, listening, waiting for something. Anything to happen. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but my feet stayed planted, like I was afraid that turning my back would invite pursuit. Nothing came. Eventually, the rain smoothed itself out. The water resumed a more natural flow. The alley settled back into something that almost resembled normal. Almost. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the drain until I reached the cruiser. I climbed inside, locked the doors, and sat there with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Not real. Real. Not real. I repeated it until my breathing slowed, until my thoughts lined up again. I told myself I'd imagined the hand. A trick of shadow and exhaustion, fear filling in gaps where there was nothing. I drove the rest of the shift on autopilot. Routine calls, domestic disputes, a fender bender. Faces blurred together. My mind kept circling back to the alley, to the way the darkness beneath the street had seemed to notice me noticing it. I didn't write it up. Not really. My report mentioned an alley check, no sign of trespassing, possible animal noise. I left out the drain, left out the hand, left out the breathing. I told myself I was being practical. There was no proof, no evidence. Writing it down would only invite questions I couldn't answer. But that wasn't the real reason. The real reason was simpler and worse. Some part of me knew that once it was on paper, it would become real in a way I couldn't undo. And if it was real, then I'd have to accept what that meant about the city I walked every night. I finished my shift just before dawn. The rain had stopped by then, leaving the streets slick and reflective. As I drove home, I found myself scanning every gutter, every curb, every dark opening where water disappeared. Everything looked normal. That didn't help. I slept badly that day. Dreams full of tight spaces and heavy air. Woke up with the taste of metal in my mouth and the sense that something had been listening while I slept. When I went back on duty the next night, I tried to convince myself it would fade. One strange call. One bad moment. That happens. Except it didn't fade. It followed me. And the next time I heard that breathing sound, it wasn't coming from an alley. It was coming from inside the walls of my apartment. The first night I heard it in my apartment, I lay perfectly still and counted my breaths. The building was old. Everyone knew that. Pipes knocked. Radiators hissed. Floors creaked when your neighbors shifted in their sleep. Those sounds had rhythms, personalities. You learned them the same way you learned the moods of a partner. This sound didn't belong to the building. It came from the bathroom wall. Slow, drawn out, like something learning how to breathe. I sat up in bed and waited for it to stop. I told myself it was water pressure. Someone showering late. The rain from earlier finally working its way through the system. But the sound wasn't moving. It wasn't traveling through the pipes like normal noise does. It stayed in one place, just behind the tile. Not real. Real. Not real. I got out of bed and crossed the apartment barefoot, every step deliberate. The bathroom light flicked on too bright, too sudden. For a moment, everything looked normal. Sink. Toilet. shower curtain hanging crooked like it always did. The sound stopped. That silence again, that immediate, attentive quiet. I stood there longer than I should have, listening for it to return. It didn't. Eventually, I convinced myself I'd imagined it and went back to bed. I didn't sleep after that. The next few days blurred together. I found myself listening to drains everywhere. At work, in public restrooms, on the street when it rained. Every storm gutter became something I couldn't quite look away from. I started noticing things I hadn't before. How often people avoided certain alleys without realizing it. How some blocks in Boyle Heights flooded even when it barely rained. How the city's storm system wasn't mapped as cleanly as the official diagrams claimed. Gaps. Old tunnels sealed off, then reopened. Infrastructure layered over itself until no one really knew what was underneath anymore. I asked around, casually at first. Made jokes about raccoons in the drains, about weird noises. Most people laughed it off. A few didn't. An older officer, close to retirement, the kind of guy who never volunteered information, paused when I mentioned the alley. His expression tightened just a little. He asked which block. When I told him, he nodded once and changed the subject. That stuck with me. I went back to the alley on my next night off. I told myself I was just checking something. Curiosity. Closure. I parked farther away this time and approached on foot, trying to see it the way a civilian might. The alley looked the same. Dry now. Empty. The storm drain sat quietly in its place, unremarkable in the daylight glow of street lamps. I crouched near it and listened. Nothing. I was about to stand when I noticed the markings. They were faint, almost invisible, unless you knew to look. Chalk lines along the edge of the grate, smudged by rain and shoes. Not random, deliberate. Small symbols I didn't recognize, repeated in different orientations, like someone had circled the drain more than once, unsure which direction mattered. My pulse picked up. I scanned the alley, half expecting someone to be watching me. It was empty. I reached out and touched the iron bars. Cold. Solid. Ordinary. The breathing started immediately. This time, it wasn't subtle. It surged up from below, filling the space beneath the street with the sound of lungs working too hard. The grate vibrated under my hand, just barely. Enough that I could feel it in my fingertips. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and drew my weapon. The beam of my flashlight cut down into the darkness again, hands shaking despite my effort to steady them. Something moved. Not just a hand this time. A shape unfolded itself from the shadows, rising slowly, as if gravity were optional. Limbs bent and extended in ways that made my eyes slide off them, like my brain couldn't agree on how many there were. Pale surfaces caught the light and then lost it, as though the thing were absorbing illumination instead of reflecting it. I couldn't see its face. I don't know if it had one. What I saw was suggestion, negative space where features should have been. The sense of something oriented toward me with complete focus. It paused just beneath the bars, breathing hard, and for the first time, I felt the unmistakable certainty that it knew I was there. Not real. Real. Not real. The words broke apart in my head. I shouted then. I don't remember what I said. Some automatic command, barked out of instinct. The sound echoed off the alley walls and seemed to startle even me. The thing reacted by pressing upward. Metal groaned. The bars bowed inward, just slightly, as if tested by hands that understood leverage better than they should have. The sound of straining iron filled the alley, and with it came something else. A voice. It wasn't speaking. It was imitating. Snippets of radio chatter, distorted and overlapping. Fragments of words I recognized from years of listening. My call sign, dispatch codes. My name. That was when I fired. The shot rang out, deafening in the narrow space. Sparks flew as the bullet struck the grate. The recoil jolted up my arms, grounding me in my body again. The thing vanished. It didn't retreat so much as collapse inward, folding back into the darkness with impossible speed. The breathing cut off abruptly, leaving my ears ringing in the aftermath of the gunshot. I stood there, shaking, staring at the grate, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. The alley returned to normal. Too normal. No movement, no sound, just me, alone with the smell of gunpowder and the realization of what I'd almost done. I holstered my weapon and backed away, nausea rising in my throat. My mind raced through consequences. Paperwork, investigations, explanations that wouldn't make sense because they couldn't. I didn't call it in. I left. That night was the last time I tried to pretend it was an isolated incident. Because after that, the drains didn't wait for rain. They started breathing whenever I was near. After the alley, I stopped trusting my senses. That might sound backwards, but it's the only way I can explain it. Sight and sound had betrayed me, so I began relying on patterns instead. Data, repetition, things that could be counted. I told myself that if something was real, it would leave a trail. It would show up more than once. That was the mistake. I started small. Public records, infrastructure maps, old city planning documents that hadn't been updated in decades. Los Angeles sits on layers of itself, tunnels built, abandoned, repurposed, forgotten. Storm drains intersect with subway lines, utility corridors, spaces no one walks through unless they absolutely have to. I noticed clusters. Certain neighborhoods had more complaints about noise from drains than others. Boyle Heights, Lincoln Heights, parts of downtown near the river. The reports were always vague, scraping, breathing, whispers. Most were dismissed as animals or water pressure issues. Except some of them weren't dismissed. Some were quietly closed with no explanation at all. I talked to a few coworkers I trusted, framing it as curiosity, urban legends, weird calls. Most laughed it off. One or two went quiet. One officer, newer, jumpy, always tired, asked me if I'd ever noticed how drains sound different at night. He said it like a joke, but his eyes were searching my face for something. I didn't answer. He nodded slowly, like that was confirmation enough. I stopped sleeping. When I did drift off, I dreamed of tight spaces and pressure, of being pressed between walls that pulsed like lungs. I'd wake up convinced I was underground, that the ceiling was inches from my face, that if I inhaled too deeply, there wouldn't be room to exhale. Sometimes I woke with dirt under my fingernails. I told myself I must have scratched the wall in my sleep. Old paint. Crumbling plaster. The explanation didn't matter as much as the fact that I stopped checking. At work, I found excuses to drive past certain streets. I avoided others entirely. When it rained, my chest tightened automatically. The sound of water moving through gutters made my skin prickle. The phrase came back stronger then. Not real. Real, not real. I whispered it under my breath while washing my hands. While filling out reports, while sitting in traffic, it became a rhythm, a way to keep myself anchored. It didn't help when the city started answering back. The first time I noticed it following me was subtle. A storm drain outside my apartment building that I could have sworn hadn't been there before. Same style. Same iron bars. Same faint chalk marks, half washed away. I stood across the street and stared at it, trying to remember if it had always been there. I'd lived in that building for 3 years. I knew the block. I knew where the cracks in the sidewalk were, where the light flickered at night. I didn't remember that drain. I told myself memory is unreliable. Stress does that. Trauma does that. You fill in blanks without realizing it. That night, I heard the breathing again, not just from the bathroom wall, from the kitchen sink, from the floor drain in the laundry room down the hall, each sound slightly out of sync with the others, like multiple lungs learning how to coordinate. I pressed my ear to the wall, then pulled back immediately, heart racing. The sensation wasn't just auditory, it was physical. A faint vibration, traveling through the building, through me. I spent the rest of the night sitting on my couch with the lights on, watching the door, listening to the walls breathe. The next day, I took sick leave. I drove without thinking, letting the city carry me. I ended up near the river, standing on a bridge and staring down at the concrete channel below. The water moved slowly there, thick and dark. Drainage openings lined the sides like open mouths. I had the sudden, overwhelming thought that they weren't drains at all. They were vents. The idea settled into me with frightening ease. I started reading things I shouldn't have. Old folklore. Urban legends dismissed as superstition. Stories about cities built over older things. About underground spaces that weren't meant to be sealed. About something that lives in the spaces meant to carry waste away, feeding on what's discarded and forgotten. Most of it was nonsense. Some of it was too specific to ignore. I learned that certain symbols were traditionally used not to ward things off, but to mark them. To say, this is here, this has been acknowledged, this is being watched. The chalk marks in the alley came back to me then, the way they circled the drain, uncertain, repeated. I realized something else around the same time. The thing didn't follow everyone. It followed me. The more attention I paid to it, the more present it became. The drains near my apartment grew louder. Ones I'd never noticed before seemed to appear along my regular routes. At work, my radio crackled at odd moments, static resolving briefly into breath before cutting out again. I tried to tell myself I was unraveling, that this was a breakdown, that I needed help. But breakdowns don't rearrange the city. One night, driving home, I took a turn I'd taken 100 times before and found the road blocked by construction. Temporary fencing forced me down an unfamiliar street. Halfway along it, my headlights swept over a storm drain positioned dead center in the lane, like an obstacle placed deliberately. I slammed on the brakes and sat there, staring. The drain was breathing. I could see the water around it tremble in time with the sound. The iron bars flexed almost imperceptibly, rising and falling. For the first time, I understood something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't trapped. It was waiting. Waiting for attention, for recognition, for someone to notice it noticing them. And I had done exactly that. Not real. Real. Not real. The phrase broke down into noise. I backed the car up and took another route home, hands shaking on the wheel. That night I made a decision. If this thing existed and some part of me knew it did, then running wasn't going to help. Ignoring it only made it louder. Denial had brought me here. I needed answers, even if they broke me. Once you decide to look straight at something like this, the world starts cooperating in ways that feel intentional. That's when it gets dangerous. I began retracing my own steps, not just physically, but mentally. Every place I'd been since the alley, every drain I'd noticed, every sound that had made my skin crawl. Patterns emerged whether I wanted them to or not. It wasn't random. The drains that reacted to me weren't spread evenly across the city. They formed corridors, paths, routes that mirrored my movements, my habits, routes to and from work, to my apartment, to places I went when I needed to think. The city wasn't closing in. It was reorganizing. I started documenting everything. Not official reports, those would have ended my career faster than a bullet, but handwritten notes. Addresses, times, weather conditions. What I felt just before the breathing started. What I dreamed afterward. My notebook filled quickly. The handwriting changed over time. Neater at first, then tighter. pressed harder into the paper like I was trying to leave grooves deep enough to last. Sleep became optional. When I closed my eyes, the city rearranged itself behind my eyelids. Tunnels folded into each other. Walls pulsed. Openings widened and narrowed in slow, patient rhythms. Sometimes I woke convinced I hadn't been alone. I started hearing my own voice when I was awake. Quiet. Distorted. Whispering phrases I didn't remember saying. Radio chatter from calls long ago. Snippets of conversations with people who weren't alive anymore. The drains echoed them back. I tested it once, speaking aloud near a gutter behind a closed laundromat. I said my name, said it clearly. The breathing stopped. Then, after a pause long enough for hope to spark, it came back, matching my cadence. Learning. I stumbled away, bile rising in my throat, and laughed out loud in the empty street. The sound cracked and fell apart halfway through. Not real. Real. Not real. The phrase felt thin now. Worn out from use, I finally went back to the alley during a heavy rain, the kind that washes the city raw. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I left my phone in the car. Some instinct told me electronics only made things worse. The alley was alive. Every drain within sight was active. Water churning, iron vibrating faintly, the sound layered over itself. A chorus of breath that rose and fell asynchronously, like lungs arguing over who controlled the body. I stood in the middle of it, rain soaking through my jacket, and felt something shift inside me. Understanding doesn't always arrive as information. Sometimes it arrives as alignment. The drains weren't separate. They were connected. Not by pipes or tunnels alone, but by purpose, by function. They weren't containment. They were interface. Points where something inside the city could reach out and feel the surface. And it had chosen me as a point of contact. The breathing grew louder as that thought settled in. The nearest grate bowed upward slightly, iron protesting. Pale shapes pressed against the underside, overlapping, as if more than one limb were reaching for the same opening. I backed away slowly, hands raised, speaking without really knowing why. Apologies, bargains, denials. I didn't mean to, I said. I didn't know. The response wasn't immediate. The sound softened, slowed, like something considering. Then my radio turned on by itself. Static resolved into fragmented speech, dispatch codes, my call sign, my name again, clearer this time. Closer. I dropped the radio and stepped back, heart hammering so hard it hurt. That was when I realized the most important thing of all. It wasn't angry, it was curious. It had existed beneath the city long before me, long before patrol routes and street names and storm management systems. It had learned to listen through runoff and echo. Learned to wait. Learned patience the way only something without a lifespan needs to. I had simply become loud enough for it to notice. Once that connection formed, it couldn't be undone. After that night, things stopped pretending to be normal. Drains appeared where they shouldn't. In parking garages. In alleyways that hadn't flooded in decades. Once, in the middle of a crosswalk, iron bars interrupting white paint like a deliberate mistake. No one else reacted. People stepped around them without comment, drove over them without hesitation. Their attention slid off the details like water off glass. I realized then that whatever I'd done, whatever threshold I'd crossed, had changed the way I perceived the city permanently. I was seeing a layer that had always been there, a layer most people weren't meant to notice. I quit the force shortly after. I didn't give a real reason. Burnout. Stress. Something vague and unarguable. They let me go easier than I expected, like they were relieved. That should have scared me more than it did. Without the badge, I lost structure. Without structure, the days blurred. I walked more, wandered, followed instincts I didn't trust but couldn't ignore. The city guided me. Every path led back to water, to grates, to openings that breathed when I stood too close. I started wondering if it wanted something specific, a conversation, an acknowledgement, or if I was just the nearest available surface to press against. The dreams changed then. I was no longer trapped underground. I was standing above it, looking down through iron bars at something vast shifting in the dark. Something that extended beyond the limits of the city, beyond language, beyond the idea of being contained. And every time I woke up, I had the same thought, cold and certain. It isn't coming up. It's already everywhere. The city stopped pretending I was a visitor. That was the clearest way I could feel the change. Before, it had watched me from a distance, redirected my paths, adjusted itself subtly, the way something large shifts its weight without drawing attention. Now, it leaned in. I began noticing timing instead of location. The breathing didn't just happen near drains anymore. It happened when I paused, when I hesitated at intersections, when I stopped walking and thought too long about where I was going next, as if indecision itself were a signal flare. I tested this once. I stood on a sidewalk near an empty block and deliberately did nothing. No phone, no movement, just waited. Within seconds, the sound began beneath my feet. It rose slowly, patiently, like it was confirming something it already knew. Not real. Real, not real. The phrase felt almost mocking now. I stopped trying to document things. Writing had become unreliable. I'd open my notebook and find pages filled with words I didn't remember putting down. Diagrams of intersections. Repeated symbols sketched until the paper tore. Sometimes entire sections were missing, ripped out cleanly. I didn't remember doing that either. The dreams shifted again. They were no longer abstract, no longer metaphor. I saw the city from below, from inside the lattice of concrete and metal that carried water away. I felt pressure from all directions, not crushing, but enclosing. Protective. Like being held in a fist that could close at any moment, but hadn't decided to yet. I woke each time with the same certainty. It was learning me. I avoided mirrors after I noticed my reflection lagging just a fraction of a second. Enough to make my stomach drop. When I moved my head, my reflection followed, but not immediately, as if it had to decide to copy me. I covered the mirrors after that. The first time it came fully out of a drain, there were no theatrics. No sudden movement. No dramatic reveal. Just inevitability. I was walking home at night, taking a route I didn't remember choosing, when I felt the pressure change beneath my feet. The street lamp above flickered once, then steadied. The air felt thicker, heavier, like the moment before a storm breaks. I stopped. The drain beside the curb was old, half choked with debris. Water pooled around it, unmoving despite the slight incline of the road. The breathing started immediately, louder than it ever had before. The iron bars flexed, slowly, carefully, as if the thing beneath them was testing not the metal, but my reaction. I backed away, heart racing, but I didn't run. Some part of me knew this wasn't a chase scenario. Chasing implies urgency. This thing had none. The bars bent upward just enough for something to press through. A limb emerged, pale and elongated, joints folding inward and outward in unfamiliar sequences. It braced itself against the pavement, fingers splaying with delicate precision. Another limb followed, then another, each movement unhurried. The body that followed didn't climb so much as unfold. It was taller than it should have been. Longer. Portions of it seemed unfinished, as though they were suggestions rather than completed shapes. It didn't stand upright immediately. It hovered close to the ground, supported by too many points of contact. I couldn't find its face. Every time I tried to focus on where one should be, my vision slid away, caught on the wrong detail. a curve that didn't align, a shadow that wasn't cast correctly. The breathing slowed as it emerged, becoming steadier, deeper, satisfied. It didn't rush me, didn't reach out. It simply oriented itself in my direction, all of its attention narrowing down to the space I occupied. I realized then that fear wasn't the emotion it was eliciting. It was recognition. The same feeling you get when you realize you've been expected. Not real. Real. Not real. The words didn't mean anything anymore. It leaned closer, and I felt pressure behind my eyes, like something was pushing from the inside. Images flooded my mind unbidden, storms long past, the city half-built, water carving paths through dirt before streets existed, people layering concrete over spaces they didn't understand, trusting thickness over comprehension. The thing didn't communicate with words, it shared context. I understood then that it wasn't singular. Not really. It was distributed. A presence spread thin through every channel meant to carry excess away. It experienced the city as a body, each drain a nerve ending, each tunnel a vein. And I was standing inside its nervous system. It withdrew slightly, limbs folding back toward the grate, but it didn't disappear. It remained partially out, anchored to the surface now, no longer confined to below. That was worse. Because now it could choose when to be seen. When it finally retreated, the iron bars slid back into place as if they had never been disturbed. The street returned to normal. Cars passed at the far end of the block. Someone laughed somewhere nearby. I stood there shaking, aware of something new and final. It didn't need to hide from me anymore. I went home and packed a bag that night. Not carefully, not logically, just essentials grabbed with shaking hands. I didn't know where I was going, only that staying felt like consent. As I closed the door behind me, I heard the breathing again, faint but present, vibrating through the floor. It wasn't coming from one place. It was coming from everywhere beneath me. And for the first time, I felt the certainty that leaving the city wouldn't make a difference. Because the city wasn't the container. It was the extension. There is a moment, right before something breaks, where clarity becomes unbearable. That's where this part begins. I didn't leave the city the way people imagine leaving. There was no dramatic escape, no final look in the rearview mirror as the skyline shrank behind me. I drove until the roads became unfamiliar, until street names lost their associations, until I reached a motel whose sign buzzed faintly and whose parking lot smelled like damp dust and neglect. I chose it because it had no visible storm drains out front. That detail mattered to me then. I slept for 12 hours straight. When I woke up, I felt worse. The silence in the room wasn't clean. It had weight. The kind that presses against your ears and makes you aware of your own breathing. I lay there staring at the ceiling, waiting for the familiar sensation of pressure beneath me. It didn't come. For a brief, dangerous moment, hope flared. Not real, not real. The phrase returned, fragile but present. I sat up slowly, listening. Nothing but distant traffic and the hum of an aging air conditioner. I laughed quietly to myself, the sound brittle, like glass tapped too hard. I showered. I ate vending machine food. I tried to think about normal things. Bills, logistics, what came next. That was my mistake. The moment I started planning, the pressure returned. Not from below, from inside. It began as a tightness behind my eyes, a sensation like holding your breath too long. Images surfaced uninvited. The alley. The iron bars bending. The way the thing had oriented itself toward me, not with hunger or hostility, but with attention. Understanding began threading itself together in my mind, piece by piece. The city hadn't been hiding it. It had been filtering it. Storm drains weren't prisons or gates. They were regulators, pressure valves. The thing beneath the city didn't want out, not fully. It wanted equilibrium. It wanted to breathe without tearing the surface apart, and I had disrupted that balance by noticing it. Awareness was the trigger. I realized then why most people never saw it, why their eyes slid off details, why drains stayed invisible to them even when they were right in front of their faces. The city had learned how to protect itself from attention, to dull perception, to keep the system stable. I was an anomaly. Something about me, training, vigilance, habit, had kept my awareness sharp enough to pierce the filter. Once pierced, it couldn't be resealed. The motel room began to feel smaller as this realization took hold. The walls seemed closer, the floor too solid. I pressed my palms against it, half expecting vibration. I felt something. Not movement. Response. The city didn't end at city limits. That had been my first wrong assumption. Infrastructure spreads. Water systems stretch outward, connecting towns and regions. The thing beneath Los Angeles wasn't confined to Los Angeles. It was rooted there, anchored. But its reach extended along every channel carved to move water away from human spaces. I left the motel that afternoon without checking out. I drove aimlessly, trying to outrun a realization that moved faster than any vehicle. Every rest stop, every gas station, every parking lot had drains. Some were subtle, others obvious. All of them felt aware now, like pores in a vast, unseen skin. I stopped near a dry wash just outside the city. The land dipped, concrete giving way to exposed channels meant for flash floods. The sun was bright, harsh, stripping shadows of their comfort. I stood at the edge and looked down. No breathing, no pressure, just emptiness. Relief washed over me so strongly my knees buckled. That was when the thought finally completed itself. It doesn't need water. Water is just how it learned to listen. The ground beneath my feet thrummed faintly, like a distant engine starting. Not loud, not dramatic, just present enough to register. I staggered back, heart pounding, and laughed again, the sound ragged and uncontrolled. Not real. Real. Not real. The phrase fractured into nonsense. That night, the dreams stopped being dreams. I didn't sleep so much as enter a state where images replaced thought entirely. I saw the city as it truly was, not buildings and roads, but layers of pressure and release. Human structures sat atop a living system they didn't understand, trusting that complexity alone would keep them safe. The thing beneath wasn't malicious. It was adaptive. And it had adapted to me. I understood then what the symbols meant. The chalk marks, the half-erased warnings. They weren't meant to stop it. They were meant to signal to others like me. Someone noticed this. Someone else survived it. Someone else failed. I woke with the certainty that it was no longer content to observe. I had crossed from observer to participant. The next time it spoke to me, there were no sounds, no imitation, no radio chatter. The communication arrived fully formed, bypassing language entirely. It showed me how it experienced attention. Awareness was pressure. Focus was weight. When something looked at it too closely, too persistently, the pressure built. Too much pressure caused instability, breaches. I was a breach. It showed me the solution, not disappearance. Integration. The city didn't need fewer observers. It needed buffers. Intermediaries. People who could perceive without panicking, who could notice without escalating, who could absorb awareness and diffuse it harmlessly. People like me. I screamed then, finally. Not because of fear, but because of understanding. This wasn't haunting. It was recruitment. Every moment after that felt borrowed. My thoughts no longer felt entirely private. When I focused too long on something mundane, a crack in the sidewalk, a storm gutter clogged with leaves, I felt the attention ripple outward. traveling through systems I couldn't see. I began deliberately dulling my awareness, avoiding details, letting my gaze slide, practicing not noticing. It worked. Partially. The pressure eased. The breathing faded into the background. The city loosened its grip on me just enough for function. That was when I realized the final, unbearable truth. It hadn't chosen me at random. It chose people who resisted it. People who tried to look away. People who would never fully accept it. Because resistance created tension, and tension was how it learned. I am not unique. I am a prototype. I stopped trying to explain myself to other people. That happened gradually, without ceremony. At first, I still tested the edges, careful phrases, vague references, jokes about infrastructure and sleeplessness. I watched faces as I spoke, looking for flickers of recognition. I never found any. Conversations drifted. People nodded politely and moved on. Whatever filter the city used on them, it worked perfectly. On me, it had failed. Days passed without structure. I stopped measuring time by hours and started measuring it by pressure, by how close the ground beneath me felt, by how heavy the air grew when I stayed still too long. I learned to keep moving. Walking became my defense. Motion diluted attention. As long as I flowed, the city did not focus on me as sharply. I walked neighborhoods until my legs burned, choosing routes that felt deliberately dull. Big streets, open spaces, places where water didn't linger. Even then, I could feel it. A low awareness, not active, not aggressive, just present. Like the feeling of being watched from a distance by someone patient enough to wait years for you to turn around. I understood now why people disappear in cities without explanation. Why some leave everything behind without a word. Why others stay but slowly hollow out, becoming less specific, less anchored, until even their memories feel secondhand. Some of them had noticed too much. Some of them had been noticed back. I tried leaving again. Not just the city this time, but the region. I drove east until the landscape dried out, until storm drains gave way to ditches and culverts, until rain became rare enough to feel theoretical. For a while, it worked. The pressure faded. The nights grew quieter. I slept longer than a few hours at a time. I began to believe, dangerously, that distance might weaken the connection. Then it rained. Not a storm, just enough. I was standing outside a grocery store when I heard it. That familiar, intimate pull. Not loud, not dramatic, just undeniable. I followed the sound around the building, heart sinking with each step. A drainage pipe, narrow, rusted, half buried in gravel, breathing. I didn't run this time. I didn't freeze either. I crouched near it, studying the opening with a detached curiosity that frightened me more than panic ever had. I understood then that geography didn't matter. It wasn't bound to one city. It was bound to systems. To the ways humans reshaped land to carry excess away, assuming that removal equaled disappearance. Nothing disappears. It only relocates. That night, I stopped thinking of it as an entity. That word implies boundaries. This was a process, a distributed intelligence that had grown alongside human development, adapting to the structures meant to ignore it. A thing that learned patience because impatience was unnecessary. It could wait out civilizations. I thought of Boyle Heights, of the alley, of how ordinary it had looked before I paid attention. I wondered how many others had stood where I had stood, felt what I had felt, and turned away just in time, and how many hadn't. The pressure inside my head returned slowly over the following weeks, not painful, not overwhelming, just present enough to shape my thoughts. I began anticipating it, noticing when my awareness sharpened too much, when curiosity tipped toward danger. I learned to blur my focus intentionally, to glance instead of stare, to accept surface explanations without probing deeper. This was what it wanted. Not worship, not obedience, moderation. I became good at it, too good. Sometimes I'd catch myself ignoring things that should have concerned me, sounds, movements, details that once would have triggered investigation. My instincts dulled, smoothed over. I was becoming what the city needed, a buffer. I realized then why it hadn't killed me, why it hadn't dragged me underground or erased me entirely. Dead observers don't help. Living ones can be shaped. That's when the recordings started. I don't remember deciding to make them. I'd find tapes labeled in my handwriting, stacked neatly on my desk. Hours of audio I didn't remember recording. My voice, calm, methodical, explaining things I didn't consciously recall learning. Patterns, thresholds, warnings, instructions. I listened to one all the way through once. I couldn't sleep for 3 days afterward. The voice on the tape wasn't frightened. It was instructional. It spoke about awareness like a contaminant, about cities as living compromise, about how attention spreads through systems the same way pressure does, and how unmanaged focus causes rupture. It spoke about people like you. Listeners, witnesses. I stopped listening after that. I started making this recording instead. Not for clarity, not for help, for leakage. Some part of me believes that saying it this way, unstructured, confessional, uncertain, might disrupt the process. That doubt carries less weight than certainty. That fear is safer than understanding. I don't know if that's true. I do know this. If you're listening to this and feeling unsettled, that's normal. If you've suddenly become aware of the ground beneath you, of water moving through places you can't see, that's not coincidence. Attention is contagious. I don't know where this recording will end up. Found footage. Evidence. Entertainment. I suppose it doesn't matter. The city absorbs stories the same way it absorbs rain. Still, I need to say this plainly, even if it costs me whatever distance I've managed to maintain. If you ever notice water pulling instead of flowing, don't linger. If you ever hear breathing where there shouldn't be lungs, don't investigate. And if you ever find yourself standing over a storm drain wondering why it feels like it's waiting for you, stop, look away, let the thought pass. Because the moment you decide to understand it, you invite it to understand you. I can feel it now, even as I speak this. A tightening. A gentle pressure, like a hand resting on the back of my thoughts. It knows I'm telling you. It's not angry. It's curious. That's the worst part. I don't know how much longer I'll be able to keep this distance. I can already feel my focus sharpening, drawn inward despite myself. The phrases I used to rely on don't hold anymore. Not real. Real. Not real. They collapse into each other. If this ends abruptly, don't assume anything dramatic happened. Assume I finally understood too well. Assume I stopped resisting. Assume I became quiet enough to be useful. And if you're hearing this now, really hearing it, if something in your environment suddenly feels closer than it did a moment ago, then I'm sorry. Because it already knows you noticed. And once that happens, the city never quite lets go.